To all storytellers and story lovers, my name is Laksh Datta. I host and produce the Jaipur Bites podcast, where you can hear many of the amazing sessions from the Jaipur Literature Festival. I also produce a few other podcasts, as you can see right here. English, Hindi, fiction, non-fiction. If you see something you like, maybe you can take a screenshot of this right now. I'll give you a second. And tune in later. Find them on your favorite podcast app.
We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It is our pleasure to present today Stormy Past, Contentious Present, the First Amendment of the Constitution of India, Tripurdaman Singh, in conversation with Karan Thapar. Tripurdaman Singh's latest book, 16 Stormy Days, the story of the First Amendment of the Constitution of India, is a fascinating look into the turbulent history and contentious legacy of the First Amendment of the Constitution. Rooted in parliamentary debates, press reports, judicial pronouncements, and existing scholarship, the book takes a deep dive into the series of events that led Prime Minister Nehru to make this sweeping amendment in a constitution he had so passionately championed. Singh is a British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London. In conversation with journalist and writer Karan Thapar, Singh explores the nascent years of India in the context of what he calls the first great battle of ideas. Tripurdaman Singh is a historian of South Asia and currently the British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, University of London. He is the author of two acclaimed books, 16 Stormy Days and Imperial Sovereignty and Local Politics. Karan Thapar trained as a correspondent, producer, editor and presenter in the United Kingdom. He currently heads Infotainment Television, a production house that makes programs for the BBC channel, NewsAsia, CNBC, CNN News 18 and Doordarshan. Perhaps the most prestigious program Thapar has presented is the BBC series HARDtalk INDIA, modelled on the lines of the BBC's long-standing program. His other accolades include numerous Asian Television Awards, the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award, and most recently, in 2017, G.K. Reddy Memorial Award for Excellence in Journalism. Since 2004, Thapar has presented India Tonight on CNBC. In 2006, he launched the primetime interview program Devil's Advocate on CNN News 18. Also a columnist, he writes for the Hindustan Times. In 2006, a collection of Thapar's Sunday Sentiments columns was published in a book called Sunday Sentiments by Wisdom Tree. Also, in 2006, a collection of his face-to-face interviews for the BBC was published as a book called Face to Face India by Penguin. In 2009, HarperCollins published a second collection of Sunday Sentiments under the title More Salt Than Pepper. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Stormy Past, Contentious Present, the First Amendment of the Constitution of India, Tripurdaman Singh, in conversation with Karan Thapar. Over to you, Karan.
Tripurdaman, you write that Nehru's motivation in pushing through the First Amendment was his belief that the original constitution was blocking his policies and overturning his reforms. In fact, I'm going to quote from your book. You write, "Zamindars, businessmen, editors, and concerned individuals had repeatedly taken the central and state governments to court, and the courts had come down heavily on the side of the citizens and struck mighty blows against the government." Can you give me some sense of the sort of policies and the sort of reforms the courts had blocked?
So there were three sort of main tracks of reform that, two main tracks of reform really that Nehru was getting at. One was zamindari abolition, which had not exactly been blocked. It had just been held up. in Bihar, where the court had basically struck down the Zamindari abolition law not on the basis of the right to property, but because it violated the right to equality. The second was community-based reservations, which had been struck down as unconstitutional because they violated the right to freedom against discrimination. And then, of course, there was freedom of speech, which essentially the government had been using Public Safety Acts and Section 124A, which is sedition, to clamp down on critical voices. And in two acclaimed judgments, the Supreme Court struck down these Public Safety Acts and censorship of magazines and newspapers as being unconstitutional. So there were these essentially three tracks which kind of came together in the first 6 months of the Constitution coming into force.
I'll come to each of those three in a moment's time, because that, in a sense, would be the content of the First Amendment. But first, before we go into details, does it follow that Nehru, with the First Amendment, established the tradition, established the precedent of amending the Constitution to overcome adverse judicial pronouncements? I know his predecessors took this practice and tradition a lot further, but did he start it?
He did, and this was it was very, very early on as well. So there were questions not merely about the content of the amendment itself, but also the timing and the way and the kind of way of doing it, really. So the First Amendment did establish the precedent. There's nothing inherently wrong, I could point out, with amending the Constitution to overturn judicial pronouncements, because that's something that on occasion happens everywhere. But the method in which it was done and the point in time at which it was done set a very, very unhealthy precedent.
Let's then, at this point, come to the sort of issues, the sort of laws, the sort of rights that were part of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment was a package of measures. Mm-hmm. Now, you point out that several fundamental rights ended up getting adversely affected by the First Amendment, and I want to talk about at least 3 or 4 of them one by one. First, you say it introduced new grounds on which freedom of speech could be curbed. Could you give me a sense of what these grounds were and why you believe they were particularly disturbing?
So in the original Constitution, as it had been passed in 1950, the grounds on which freedom of speech could be curbed had been limited to libel, slander, defamation, contempt of court, and undermining the security of the state or tending to overthrow it. Now, what the amendment did was first to introduce public order as a grounds to curtail the freedom of speech, and then it changed the expression undermining the security of the state or tending to overthrow it to the interests of the security of the state. So it drastically lowered the bar that a piece of legislation had to kind of hop over in order to be found constitutional. And so it widened the Overton window, really, of what the government could do to clamp down on freedom of speech.
In other words, it became a lot easier for the government to curb speech because, as you said, the bar had been lowered. I think yes. I'm right in saying that one of the things your book makes a point of is that in the process of lowering the bar, Nehru created grounds to validate sedition. It's a law that is now being used widely, let me add, misused most of the time. And this was a consequence of the fact that the First Amendment permitted freedom of speech to be curbed in the interests of the security of the state. Can you explain this point a little bit more fully? How does permitting freedom of speech to be curbed in the interests of the security of the state validate sedition?
So in a very famous judgment I think it was in September 1950, the High Court, the Punjab High Court had quashed a case of sedition against the Akali leader, Master Tara Singh, very firmly declaring that sedition was unconstitutional And the reasoning it gave was that as long as a law such as this could be used to clamp down on people exciting quote unquote disaffection or dislike of the government, short of undermining the security of the state, the entire law had to be held to be unconstitutional. And once, because the bar, again, of undermining the security of the state or tending to overthrow it was really high, and that piece of legislation didn't manage to, in a way, sort of hop over it. Once the expression itself was changed to the interests of the security of the state, it was no longer necessary for the law of sedition to cross that high bar. All the state really had to do now was to say, well, clamping down on security or clamping down on someone's speech is in the interests of the security of the state. So the law can be justified in terms of the interests to the security of the state, rather than having to sort of cross the threshold of undermining it to an extent where there is a risk of the state being overthrown.
This is a very important point. Let me recap what I think I've understood and then correct me if I'm wrong. And I'm recapping it because sedition seems to be one of the favorite instruments of the Modi government. But let's not be unfair to Mr. Modi. It was pretty favorable to previous governments as well. It's not that the UP didn't use sedition. And if I've understood you correctly, what you've said is that although sedition existed in the penal code when India got independence, a case in 1950 in the Punjab High Court, I think you called it the Master Tara Singh case, either overturned this particular clause or read it down substantially. However, the first amendment, which came shortly thereafter, amended the grounds on which freedom of speech could be curbed, thus reintroducing the law of sedition, which the Punjab High Court had read down. Is that a correct understanding of what you said?
Yeah, exactly.
Then it also follows that if Nehru had not passed the First Amendment, sedition would have been read down, and the manner in which it's been used, or I should add abused, by governments since then would not have been possible. Nehru obviously didn't realize how it would be misused, but he laid the ground for it to be misused.
He did lay the grounds, and in a sense, it's also not entirely correct to say that he didn't realize the grounds on which it could be misused, because he, and at some point in the book, I quote him writing to his chief ministers, advising them, not to misuse it. So, and in the debates in the parliament, he was repeatedly warned that it could be misused, most famously by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, the founder of the Jan Sangh, who told him that he was essentially creating legal tools that would one day be used, against his ideological successors, because he says it's possible that you might rule for this generation, the next generation, and generations to come, but please think about what might happen if someone else comes into power. So Nehru, in a way, I think it's not that he didn't know that it could be misused. I think he just sort of assumed that it wouldn't be, because he kept saying, well, everyone should trust him and everyone should trust Parliament and democracy itself.
This is then even worse. In other words, what you're stating, is that Nehru passed this amendment with his eyes wide open. He'd been cautioned. He himself, in turn, had cautioned state chief ministers not to misuse the law. He was therefore aware of the potential to misuse it. He was simply relying, probably naively or perhaps foolishly, on the belief that successors to the prime ministership or future chief ministers would not misuse the law. That, of course, ran against the very grain of human experience, because when there are laws that can be misused, they tend to be misused. So was this naivete on Nehru's part, or folly, or both?
A bit of both, I think, because when he winds up the debate, he also calls the First Amendment, he sort of says, we don't want to use it, but we're giving it as a gift to the succeeding generations to use as they see fit for the advance of the nation. And the reality of how they use it is in front of you.
What an interesting phrase you use. This is a gift to future generations. It reminds me of Mr. Modi and the farm laws, which he says are a gift to farmers. And the farmers are very clearly at this moment saying, thank you, but we'd rather not have this gift. Unfortunately, the Indian people were not in a position to say to Nehru, thank you, but keep this gift. Let's come at this point to a second element of the First Amendment. I think I'm right in pointing out that it also seriously affected the right to property because it allowed the state to acquire zamindar lands without paying equitable compensation. Now, India was a socialistic, to use the way the Congress phrases it, country at the time. And many would have said, in a poor country, this is understandable, this is acceptable. How would you first respond to that?
Well, two responses. The first was that even contemporary observers at the time, from top to bottom, and this was most famously brought out by no less than the president, Rajendra Prasad, who wrote to Nehru cautioning him against the amendment, was that and it was again noted by the press at the time as well, was that the right to property was not really coming in the way of zamindari abolition at all. The only zamindari abolition law that had been struck down was Bihar, and it had been struck down not due to the right to property, but due to the right to equality, because within the category of zamindars whose zamindaris were being acquired, some were being paid 20 years worth of revenue, some were being paid 3 years worth of revenue, depending on the size, and the sort of the numbers were clearly arbitrary, because if someone's income from their land was 20,000 rupees a year, they were to get 20 years worth of revenue as compensation. And if somebody's income was above a certain threshold, they would only get 3 years worth of compensation. So those were the grounds on which the Bihar High Court found the law to be unconstitutional. So the right to property was not really a stumbling block per se. And there was no real pressing need to amend it in that fashion. It's just that that Nehru essentially decided that this was a policy that he himself had championed. He was personally associated with it. And as he said after the judgment was delivered, that if the Constitution comes in the way of the wishes of the people as established by the legislature, then the Constitution has to give way. So it was, I think it was a form of overreach, really, because out of all of the three tracks, this was the least of his stumbling blocks.
Tell me something, and I'm not sure if this is part of your book or not, but it's an issue that I've heard people raise about the manner in which the First Amendment affected the right to property. After the First Amendment, did the right of property continue as a fundamental right, or did it cease to be a fundamental right?
No, so it continued to be a fundamental right, but what the amendment did was that it basically listed out the reasons based on which the government could effectively ignore the right to property, saying notwithstanding anything, so the language used is notwithstanding anything said in the article, the government can do X, Y, and Z. And more in a sort of more damning fashion, what they added to Article 31, which is the right to property, was Article 31B, which created what's called the Ninth Schedule. And what the Ninth Schedule, what Article 31B and the Ninth Schedule collectively did was that they allowed the government to place pieces of legislation in a constitutional schedule that made them immune to judicial review. So the courts could not adjudicate on these laws.
In fact, in a very real sense, the Ninth Schedule, which you're mentioning and talking about at this moment, is another critical part of the First Amendment, and perhaps some would say the most worrying, the most disturbing. Because what the Ninth Schedule does, and I'm quoting you, is it creates an area within the Constitution where laws could be placed to make them immune to judicial challenge, even if they violated fundamental rights. In other words, through the ninth schedule, the Constitution ends up protecting laws that are actually unconstitutional. It's not just an anomaly, it's almost a contradiction, and yet there it is, it's part of our Constitution. Would you say that in a sense this is the worst bit of the amendments that made up the First Amendment?
But I think both that and the sort of extension of grounds on which freedom of speech could be curbed were, both were equally bad. But as far as the ninth schedule goes, it's a kind of constitutional device that had never been seen or heard of anywhere in the world, and I doubt that it's ever been seen or heard of anywhere in the world since. And it allowed, essentially, the government to have laws that were blatantly unconstitutional. It was a sort of constitutional black box in a way into which nobody could peer, which leads to a very funny quip by the late Chief Justice Hidayatullah, where he said the Indian Constitution is the only one in the world that requires protection against itself. And that's essentially what the ninth schedule did.
Let me at this point pick up on something that you said a moment ago. It was very reflective of Nehru's attitude to the Constitution. You said his belief was that where the Constitution came in the way of the will of the people, the Constitution must be amended. And I want to make 2 points there. First of all, he was saying this roughly 18 months after the Constitution had come into being. After all, it only came into being on the 26th of January 1950, and the First Amendment was passed somewhere in June 51. And secondly, constitutions are given to countries as frameworks to determine their politics for decades, if not centuries. Here, Nehru was claiming 18 months later that if the will of the people is somehow being obstructed by the Constitution must be amended. So first of all, that does suggest that his commitment to the Constitution wasn't great. He was quite happy to change it fairly radically within 18 months of its coming into effect. And the second thing it suggests is that this concept of the will of the people, who determines the will of the people? Is it by any chance Nehru himself? Because he's Prime Minister and he believes he's the beloved of India. And therefore, does the will of the people end up becoming, if I, Nehru, am being thwarted by the Constitution, then the Constitution must give way to me?
In one sense, yes, because we have to remember that it was a provisional parliament, albeit most of the members of the provisional parliament had been members of the Constituent Assembly, so it was more or less by and large, the same people. But we also have to remember that it was the Constituent Assembly had been elected on a limited and indirect franchise. So the claim of Nehru's claim of "quote unquote" the will of the people is sketchy, to say the least, and that's the reason that several people, among them the leader of the opposition, Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, the president, Rajendra Prasad, the speaker, G.V. Mavlankar, and of course, many of his opponents in parliament, including J.B. Kripalani, etc., opposed the timing of the amendment and the method and the sort of method that was being used, because to claim that they had the will of the people behind them could not be upheld.
Absolutely. And as you point out, the assembly as it existed at the time was based upon a limited franchise, and it was indirectly elected, and therefore to conclude from that it represents the will of the people is a fairly great stretch. Nonetheless, this concept, will of the people, was a very easy one for Nehru to use as an explanation or excuse for amending a constitution which was only 18 months old at the time. Somehow when you talk of the will of the people, it seems or appears as if the whole country is behind you and the constitution is just a paper document that can't stand in the way. But I'll pick that point up a bit more seriously and in greater detail in a moment's time.
If I could just interrupt you on
strange way in which this amendment was pushed through Parliament. Let's first briefly talk about the impact the First Amendment had on Indian politics. To begin with, we've already established that the First Amendment started the precedent of amending the Constitution when you found that you had unfavorable judicial pronouncements or verdicts that you didn't like. Did it also start the tradition of using executive power to subdue the judiciary?
Yes, in a way it did. I mean, there's nothing, again, I might add that there's nothing per se wrong in and of itself in using a sort of constitutional amendment to get by to sort of overturn a judicial verdict, because at the end of the day, lawmaking power and the amending power has been granted to Parliament by the Constitution itself. But the justification that was used by Nehru, which sort of created which created something that I might call normative power behind one brand of thinking, really set a trend from which there was no going back, because what they did was not only did they overturn the judicial verdicts, they also overturned it with retrospective effects, because what the amendment did was to say that none of these laws were void or were ever to be considered to have been void. So it was also a very interesting use of retrospective legislation, which sort of made it okay to go down that route as well.
Now, the scholar Nivedita Menon, and you quote her in your book, points out a second sense in which the First Amendment has had an impact on Indian politics. She says that up till the First Amendment, the individual was at the center of the Constitution. That centrality of the individual, qua class, caste, community, and state, was altered fairly significantly to the disadvantage of the individual after the First Amendment. Would you agree with that point?
Yes. The First Amendment certainly deprivileges the individual to a very large extent. The Constitution itself had tried to strike a balance between individual rights and a sort of commitment to social reform, what I refer to as a social revolution in my book. So in one sense, they were aware that caste, community, etc. were important categories in Indian political life, and they were intent on pushing through their reforms. But it also is true that the individual did lie at the center of the Constitution, and you see that very clearly in the chapter on fundamental rights. And as far as the First Amendment went, it tilted the balance so far against the individual, because it privileged, in one sense, the state when it came to freedom of speech and the right to property, and it privileged caste and community when it came to the right to freedom against discrimination.
Now, there's a third impact that you write about in your book that the First Amendment has had on the way Indian politics has developed post-Nehru. You say it opened the floodgates for drastic and oppressive laws like the National Security Act, the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, and the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which you add are often used to ban books, arrest journalists, jail activists, and harass political opponents. And once again, we're living in a time when these laws are being used against ordinary citizens for precisely those purposes. But can you explain a bit more fully how the First Amendment made these draconian laws possible and their misuse?
So again, we go back to the sort of constitutional architecture that supports particular laws. Now, the constitutional expression undermining the security of the state or tending to overthrow it sets a really high bar that a law has to overcome before it can be applied or before it can be legislated. whereas the expression, the interests of the security of the state, again, sets a very, very, very low threshold. And it's this difference in terminology that enables these laws to exist in the form that they do and to be utilized in the form that they do, because it's in the interests of the security of the state. You no longer have to undermine the security of a state to an extent where it's possible that it might be overthrown. All that now has to be done is it merely has to be in the interest of the security of the state to have a law like this and to apply it in the fashion that it is doing. And so that's what makes that sort of tiny semantic change, in a way, is what makes a lot of this possible. And
these laws may not have been legislated by Nehru. Most of them came into being long after he was dead and gone, but they're directly connectable to what Nehru did. And in that, I suppose, metaphorical sense, they are Nehru's children.
In some sense, they are, because, again, it's not as if he wasn't warned that these would be the consequences. The All India Newspaper Editors Conference sent delegations to him, representations to him. He was warned by bar associations, several civil society organizations, and everyone made the same point, that you're essentially opening the floodgates to repression and the only sort of reasoning that you can give is to say, well, people should trust Parliament. And Nehru again says that as well, that the Parliament should be trusted with these.
If Nehru had lived for 50 years beyond when he died, he would have realized that when he says people should trust Parliament, he's asking almost the impossible of them. Trust of politicians, not Parliament the institution, but the politicians who man it, is probably at rock bottom at the moment, but that's my personal observation. Let's come to the manner in which the First Amendment was passed. And I might ask you to be a little quicker in your answers, because I think we have only about 10, 12 minutes left. Now, the first thing I noticed from your book is that the amendment was passed by an unelected provisional parliament, not a full-fledged parliament. Isn't that in itself rather odd?
Yes, and a lot of people found it odd as well, especially because there didn't seem to be any pressing hurry. So it was really odd. And the other odd part was that it only had one house, and because the Rajya Sabha had not been elected.
And in fact, in your book, you reveal how Nehru misused powers the Constitution gave him for a very different reason, to overcome the fact that there wasn't a second house, there wasn't a Rajya Sabha. I'll just go back and point this out, that our Constitution permits amendments provided they've been passed by a 2/3 majority of both houses. But the Rajya Sabha didn't exist in June 1951 when the First Amendment was passed, and Nehru got over this problem by misusing the powers of what's called the Constitution Removal of Difficulties Order. Now, I know this is a bit of a technical point, but it's also a very important point. So could you explain it in simple English?
So basically, as you said, Article 368, which gave Parliament the power to amend the Constitution, required two houses. But since there was only one house, and this was a provisional parliament in a transitional period, the Constitution Removal of Difficulties Order, which had been passed by the President, basically gave the government the authority to make minor adaptations to the Constitution to overcome procedural difficulties until elections could be held and a full parliament with two houses could be elected. So it was basically just meant to overcome small difficulties that might arise over constitutional interpretation when there was only a provisional parliament. Nothing this big had been envisaged or even conceived. So what Nehru did was use the Constitution Removal of Difficulties Order to adapt Article 368 to refer to Parliament rather than to two houses of Parliament. And that allowed him to pass the amendment and for the amendment to be found legal. Now, it's interesting to note that President Rajendra Prasad did not quite agree with this sleight of hand. He thought it wasn't entirely constitutional. He wrote to Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer to inquire about this point. We don't have any answer on record, but we do know that the president was uncomfortable with this sleight of hand.
If I let me make an observation at this point, what Nehru did is very similar to what Narendra Modi did in 2019 when he was amending the constitutional character of Jammu and Kashmir. In 2019, Mr. Modi used the powers given to him by Article 370 to amend Article 370 itself. In Nehru's case, he used the powers conferred by Article 392, under which the Constitution Removal of Difficulties Order was passed, to do something that wasn't envisaged by that order or by Article 392, a fairly comprehensive wholesale amendment to the Constitution. And to use your phrase, both prime ministers, Nehru and Modi, were guilty of sleights of hand.
They were, and we can't say, obviously there are no records to be had of the present period, but we do know that in 1951, the president himself was decidedly uncomfortable with this and also didn't quite consider it constitutional. He did agree to it in the end, but he wasn't quite on board.
Now, one of the interesting things that comes out from your book is that the well-known and highly regarded constitutional scholar Upendra Bakshi believed that the First Amendment was so sweeping in the changes it introduced that the Constitution thereafter, in his eyes, was the second Constitution. He didn't believe that post-amendment, the Constitution was the same as the original one. So people believe that, in fact, what Nehru did was not just to amend, but very essentially alter the essential character of the Constitution.
That's true, and it did. It did. There's no getting away from the fact that it really changes the balance of power between the citizen and the state, and between the individual and the sort of collective categories of class and caste. There simply is no getting away from it. And again, Upendra Bakshi was, of course, writing about it, but people speaking in Parliament about it, S.P. Mukherjee, J.B. Kriplani, Denat Kunzru, and very famously the Anglo-Indian educationist Frank Anthony, tell him that what you're doing is not making a minor adaptation. It's apparent that you're hitting the absolute roots of the Constitution and of the constitutional order of things. So again, there's no getting away from that fact.
We're coming to the end of this discussion. I want very quickly to ask you what this First Amendment tells us or makes us perhaps rethink what we believe to be true of three people we've considered the greats of our past. First, Nehru. We always look upon him as the man who laid the foundations of our democracy. But it emerges from your book that he was also the man who was the first to mold the Constitution.
He was the first to mold the Constitution. I mean, Nehru is a complex figure. He's given to, as all of his biographers agree, he's given to impatience. He had a great sort of moral certainties, and he was, since he had so much public support, that he really could more or less get away with doing whatever he wanted. He did do whatever he wanted. Of course, that's juxtaposed with a very pedantic commitment to the sort of procedures of democracy. In a way, there were, cabinet committees. He was very fastidious in attending Parliament, etc. But again, he's a complex figure, and we have to accept that he was flawed in many ways. And
absolutely, and the degree of commitment he showed to a constitution that was, and I keep repeating this, just 18 months old at the time, was depressingly little. Depressingly little. He believed that the will of the people could be sufficient grounds for amending a document that was just 18 months old, but was meant to last for decades, if not centuries.
True. True. I mean, in his constitutional commitment, yes, he certainly was. I mean, the commitment was far less than we imagine it to be.
Now, the second person who doesn't emerge brilliantly from this story is, in fact, B.R. Ambedkar. When the First Amendment was passed in June 1951, Ambedkar was still part of the cabinet. He only resigned several months later. So clearly, when the cabinet decided to go ahead, he was party to that decision, because if he wasn't, he should have protested, he should have resigned. And yet here is a man who we today call the father of the Indian Constitution, who was quite happy to be party to an amendment of the Constitution that undermined fundamental rights. And as Upendra Bakshi says, created a different document altogether. What does that tell us about Ambedkar and his commitment to his own Constitution?
Ambedkar, the impression that I always get from Ambedkar is that he's a bit of a misfit in the Nehru government. He's politically isolated. He doesn't carry much weight. He often doesn't get too much of a say in matters. As far as the amendment goes, Ambedkar did have a big contribution in the introduction of the word reasonable to ensure that the restrictions that could be placed on fundamental rights had to be reasonable, and presumably they had to be reasonable in the eyes of the courts. Because what Nehru wanted is, Nehru did not want the word reasonable there. He's very clear that he did not want the restrictions to clear any test of reasonableness. And that is in some ways Ambedkar's doing, that he kind of holds back that urge.
Can I interrupt? We know with hindsight, although perhaps Ambedkar would not have known this in 51, that the word reasonable has been no deterrent to the way in which these amendments have been misused. So, though you give him credit for inserting the word reasonable, it didn't make any difference. He could have resigned. After all, he's the father of the Constitution. He could have taken a much more high principled stand, but he didn't. Judging him by that standard, he let himself down.
He did, and the interesting thing is, after he did eventually resign in September 1951, October 1951, he went and argued, he appeared in court for the Zamindars of Madhya Pradesh. So I don't think he was in entire agreement with the amendment, but I think that the question of reservations and social justice kind of swung it for him. That's the impression that I get.
Now, the third person that I want to bring up in this context is Sardar Patel. He did, of course, die 6 months before the First Amendment was passed. He died in December 1950. The First Amendment was passed in June 1951. But I gather from earlier interviews you've done with me that although Sardar Patel would not have supported the way the First Amendment was amending the right to property, he had no great problem with the way the First Amendment was affecting and undermining freedom of speech. In fact, if I'm remembering and recalling what you said to me correctly, he regarded freedom of speech as irrational exuberance. That term doesn't sound like great defense and championing of freedom of speech. It sounds as if he's somewhat dismissive of it.
True. I mean, Patel had previously also hinted to Nehru that the judgments that had done away with their ability to censor the press, etc., might eventually need a constitutional amendment. So Patel approached the question from a slightly different angle, because Patel approached it keeping what he thought was the security of the state in mind. He was very worried about armed communist rebellion, and so on and so forth. So Patel really, actually, you're correct in saying that Patel really didn't really rate the freedom of speech very, very highly.
That, in a sense, is the saddest conclusion of your book. The three people that we regard as champions of democracy, three people that we look up to, Nehru, Ambedkar, Patel, were in fact very flawed in their commitment, not just to the Constitution, and I keep repeating it was only 18 months old at the time, but also pretty flawed in their commitment to fundamental rights, the most important of which, freedom of speech, they were quite happy to have amended. They may have had different reasons for agreeing to its amendment, But nonetheless, they all seem to have concurred that amending it wasn't a problem. And that is a fairly damning conclusion for people that we have grown up regarding as great founders of India.
True. There's no getting away from that fact, and that's an uncomfortable part of our history that we have to look at. But again, not just the three of them, also Rajgopalachari, who was Home Minister when the amendment was passed and part of the Nehru cabinet and on board with what was happening. So before he became the champion of Indian liberalism, he also helped give it a sort of debilitating blow.
All right, then let me end on the note, and it's not just being said in humor, that our founding fathers were also the first to bury our constitution. Not wholly, but they certainly made the first dig in the ground into which steadily thereafter their successors have been trying to push it. I thank you, Tripurdaman, for this eye-opening discussion. You revealed the history of India, the manner in which the First Amendment was passed, and what that tells us about not just Nehru, but Ambedkar, Patel, and as you added, Rajgopalachari, in ways that could be only shocking to most Indians. But it's important that we should know the truth, because after all, if our icons who stand on pedestals have feet of clay, then it's best that we know that, because they could topple over with ease. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tripurdaman and Karan, for such a fascinating conversation. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. We hope to see you in the next session.